It's about time I finally cover the Trails series in some capacity. It's a game series I hold in very high regard, if the figure permanently affixed to my arm didn't give that away already. While I wouldn't say it falls quite under hidden gem classification, it's definitely a bit niche, especially in the West, albeit somewhat understandably so. The timing felt right to talk about this series that's so dear to me thanks to the announcement of an animated series coming in 2023, as well as the international release of the next game in the series, Trails into Reverie, coming out that year as well. So, what is Trails? The Trails franchise, commonly alternatively referred to by its Japanese moniker Kiseki, even in English discussion, is a series of RPGs made by Falcom. But perhaps it would be more accurate to call it a series of RPGs. While all the Trails games feature a shared universe and continuity, they can be somewhat neatly divided into the Trails in the Sky games, Trails from Zero and to Azure games, and Trails of Cold Steel, which is the main focus of this video in particular. There's also Trails into Reverie, which is a sequel to both the Azure and Cold Steel games, set to release next year as mentioned earlier, and the newly christened series, Kuro no Kiseki, which has yet to receive an official English title, as of the time of this video. This timeline of games is actually one of the most fascinating things about the Trails series in my opinion. Since the games take place in a shared universe over the course of 10 plus entries, you might see some characters from one game show up in a future one as a cameo or even as a major role. This can be confusing as an entry point for new players, however, and I believe might be one of the contributing factors for why it could be daunting to get into the series. Trails in the Sky FC, Trails in the Sky SC, or Second Chapter, and Trails in the Sky the Third make up the first arc, referred to in the fandom as the Liberal arc for the country that most of the game's events take place in. And these three games take place in chronological order, preceding every other Trails game that releases afterwards. Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure make up the Crossbell arc, and also take place chronologically preceding the Liberal arc. This is also where the real-world release order gets kinda screwy, since they were skipped in the localization process for over a decade and, as of the time of this video, have not been officially released outside of Japan. As these games are integral to the overall continuity of the entire Trails series, this can be another roadblock for aspiring gamers, but thankfully dedicated high-quality fan translations exist, and they were what the community relied on for many years before an official release was announced. Finally, we get to the Trails of Cold Steel games, sometimes referred to as the Erebonia arc, but who's gonna call it that when you have a perfectly good excuse to say Cold Steel and not sound like a cringe edgelord? This series consists of 4 conveniently numbered games, with 1 and 2, and 3 and 4 making up 2 sorta separate mini-arcs with a time skip in between. This is where the fun timeline crossovers really come into play, as Cold Steel 1 and 2 run around the same time as the Crossbell games in universe, so you get some neat continuity nods, like a character from Cold Steel going to take a trip over to Crossbell for a major event that happens in Azure. Cold Steel 3 and 4 are where the timelines converge, which frees up characters from the previous arcs to start appearing for a grand crossover that really provides a great payoff to longtime fans of the series that have been keeping up with the games for over the years. So, personally, the Trails series is not one that I've been following for many years, as some of the longtime fans have, but it is still one that has made a pretty great impression nonetheless. To say that this series has had a tumultuous release history outside of Japan, well, it would be an understatement to say the least. And is something that I was blissfully unaware of as I started with Trails of Cold Steel 1 on a whim after seeing a Twitch streamer I follow play it back in late 2020. At that point, Trails of Cold Steel 4 had just released, so the timing seemed appropriate, and I was really craving a new RPG to really sink my teeth into after the void left behind by all the other great RPG releases that year. Seriously, 2020 was an absolutely stellar year for RPG fans, with Persona 5 Royal, Xenoblade Chronicles, Yakuza Like a Dragon, and Final Fantasy VII Remake, to name a few. Anyways, that tangent aside, I played through all of Cold Steel 1 and thoroughly enjoyed it, so I immediately went out and purchased the rest of the series. Before starting Cold Steel 2, though, I found out that Cold Steel 1 is technically the 6th game in the Trails series, and that the other arcs are highly recommended to get the full enjoyment out of later installments. Well, with the massive cliffhanger that Cold Steel 1 ended on, I was absolutely dying to move on to 2, but I was still afraid of missing out on valuable context and familiarity with some of those reoccurring characters. So I did the most rational next best thing, which was spend the next day or two doing my homework and watching nearly 20 hours of summary and recap videos, scouring the wiki pages and even the TV tropes articles for those extra in-depth insights. Yeah, it's not nearly as good as playing the games themselves, but what can I say, I'm a zoomer at heart, and I guess I needed that instant gratification. But I mean, it was 100% worth it, since I was able to pick up on all the times they referenced past events and characters without much trouble. I spent almost a whole month going through Cold Steel 1 through 4 back to back, and it was pretty magical. I'm really grateful I didn't have to suffer the wait between games personally, because without getting into specific spoiler details, some of those cliffhangers were pretty heavy. I suppose it was one of the upsides to the global pandemic that I had more free time to play these games, since each of them is a 50 to 60 plus hour RPG in its own right. So Cold Steel 1 had its moments, but it was definitely a bit more of a self-contained story, I would say. Starting with Cold Steel 2, they really hold nothing back with integrating the world and lore of the past arcs into the current one. So to address the elephant in the room, do you really have to play all 5 prior games from the Liberal and Crossbell arcs before starting Cold Steel? Well, obviously I would say, if you have the time to do so, it is 100% worth it. The narrative has been crafted over 2 decades and is still ongoing, creating a carefully interwoven storyline, the likes of which is extremely rare for any media franchise, let alone a video game. It really is something special how much effort went into building this world with multiple overarching plot lines that connect with each other and still stand strong on their own. Now, that being said, I will say that not everyone is going to want to play the older games. I know it is kind of a taboo sentiment in the community, but the Trails games before Cold Steel definitely are quite a bit more retro, lacking modern touches that we might take for granted, like voice acting and 3D models and animations. While these certainly aren't everything, and I'm by no means saying that older games don't have a place in the world, it's not completely unreasonable to say that these things might be deal breakers for some players when weighing which games to play over others, perhaps. So the path I took certainly won't be for everyone, and whether you want to play the whole series or not, the immense level of investment is a barrier for entry that makes recommending these games difficult, but the payoff, if you stick with it, is without a doubt worth it. The Cold Steel series is a perfectly serviceable standalone series of games, I would argue, and while a player going in blind might have a lot of questions about events that are referenced, the games do provide an appropriate amount of context to be enjoyable on their own. A lot of scenes and character appearances will have a lot less impact without the background knowledge going in, especially since you won't have that investment forged over several games worth of plot. But at the very least, things that are important to the events of Cold Steel themselves are explained or reiterated. I wouldn't go as far as to say Cold Steel is a reboot, because it's not, but you can definitely get a sense that it was made to serve as a suitable jumping in point for newcomers to the Trails series. Now, with that brief rundown of the series' history out of the way, it's time to talk Cold Steel. I'll try to avoid mentioning spoilers, just in case. So, Trails of Cold Steel starts off with about the most unabashedly anime JRPG setting imaginable. You got a high school with powerful teenagers rocking a rainbow of hair colors that attend classes and develop their bonds of friendship, but also explore mysterious dungeons and locales to fight monsters and eventually get wrapped up in the bigger plotline. Okay, to be fair, it is a military academy, so the combat prowess does make sense to an extent. But on a surface level, it does seem to be pretty similar to something like Persona. By the way, pro tip, never tell a Trails fan that their game is just like Persona 5, even if we were all thinking it. It really does deviate a lot just beneath the surface level comparison, I promise. So, the general story for the game tells the tale of a nation caught in the midst of political conflict, whether it be civil war, tensions with bordering nations, or other such things. This is also where the state of affairs of the settings from previous games come into play. There's a heavy emphasis on a combination of history and mythology in these games, and also giant robots, but that's something to get to later. To sum it all up, the in-universe lore is massive, and following where it goes and how it plays out is a major source of the game's intrigue. Cold Steel stars this absolute Chad of a protagonist, Reen Schwarzer from Class 7. The funny ha-ha man himself, the ideal specimen of a man, will keep all his women satisfied with high-intensity head patting and still had time to master the blade. Hyperbole aside, while he does suffer a bit from anime JRPG main character blandness at times, he does break out of a lot of the trappings those kinds of characters are plagued with, and goes through some good character development. Overall, I would say they strike a good balance with Reen and how he integrates into the plot of the games without being too overbearing and monopolizing the screen time and dialogue. So, Class 7 is basically the special snowflake class at the Thor's Military Academy, the main setting for the first Cold Steel game and an important location for the series in general. The students and teacher for Class 7 make up the main cast of characters for the series, and all but maybe one or two of them have big protagonist energy. From the initial roster of Class 7, you got colorful characters like Elisa, the token tsundere and quote-unquote canon romantic option for Reen. Gaius, the somehow most well-adjusted teenager of all time in an anime or video game. Eustace, the rich kid who ties the affairs of the group into the conflict of the noble class. Emma, the nerdy girl and designated boob joke target. Machias, the standoffish guy who takes some time to warm up to the group. Laura, the jock girl with the heart of gold. Fee, the quiet girl who's a bit of a sleepyhead. Elliot, and of course, best girl, Instructor Sarah, the teacher for the class. This is the one allotted instance of waifu bias I get in the entire video, and I'm going to use it right here. So I've kind of reduced the characters to quick tropes, but it doesn't really do them justice. Of course, you have multiple games for the characters to develop and grow with the story in ways that a lot of games with large casts of characters don't really have the luxury of doing. Character growth drives a lot of the plot, and relationships between characters, even other than with Reen, feel organic. Like if you have two certain characters in your party, sometimes they'll say special dialogue at the end of battle. While you're introduced to all of them at the start of Cold Steel 1, they get slowly drip-fed to you and rotated out over the first few sections of the game, so you really get a chance to bond with them, rather than immediately picking out your best girl and neglecting everyone else in the party to hyperfixate on that one character for the entire game. And when I say there's a large cast, there really is. By the end of Cold Steel 4, you have several dozen character options to choose from to make your party. There's also lots of instances of characters just being guest party members, like plot-relevant NPCs or past antagonists you team up with temporarily that get their own playable versions. But even just the core cast of permanent party members from game to game is pretty sizable, especially later on. Heck, even the pure NPCs end up being more involved than in most games. Like the random other students you encounter around the campus, they all have names and faces and end up becoming recurring characters with expanded roles later on in the series, something that I thought was absolutely the coolest. Alright, so I've introduced all these great characters and gassed them up somewhat. The designs and general aesthetic, I would say, are pretty on point, but the game does suffer visually to an extent. Being originally released for the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation Vita, some of the graphics, especially the character models, look kinda rough. While this does get smoothed out significantly for the PlayStation 4 native Cold Steel 3 and 4 games, it is a bit of a bad look for the series' first foray into 3D, especially considering how the sprite-based games that preceded it have aged arguably more gracefully. That being said, graphics definitely aren't everything, and it is passable, especially given the genre. While Cold Steel 3 and its following games don't necessarily have a super distinct visual art style, it's definitely a big improvement, and they get much better at including more dynamic animations and varied environments as well. What Cold Steel does manage to start off strong with is the music. The soundtrack is quite bombastic, with the battle themes in particular being very intense and catchy. While on the other hand, however, I would say, as a whole, the soundtrack is not quite as memorable as some other great Japanese RPGs of its time. It's pretty good, don't get me wrong, but there aren't a lot of tracks that I would say transcend that. Except, of course, the one playing right now. I never knew it was possible to get so emotional over a single coin. If you know, you know. And now we get to the most important part of all. How does it play? All of those factors above could be great, but if the gameplay is trash, then is the game really any good to begin with? Well, for a heavily story-driven RPG like this one, yeah, there might be some who would be willing to put up with it just to push on through the plot. Thankfully, this is not actually the case, and the game handles quite well, if not slightly generic. Not that it's by any means a bad thing. If you got a time-tested formula that you can execute on pretty well, then there might not be a need to reinvent the wheel every time, if you know what I'm saying. Especially in these days, a solid turn-based RPG is somewhat of a dying breed. Well, dying might be a bit harsh, but they're probably becoming less common as games are going more action and exploration based as a whole. Although we still got franchises like SMT or Persona and maybe Pokemon holding down the fort. Anyways, the turn-based gameplay is very by the books. You got your HP and your MP, your spells, your EXP, equipment, items, and all that good stuff. Encounters are based on overworld mobs, as is the standard for 3D RPGs these days. As far as unique battle mechanics, you got your S-crafts, which are pretty much like a super move that you can build up by charging a meter with actions. And you can activate them at any point, even immediately after you make your own move with that character, or in the middle of a group of enemies' turns. Cold Steel 3 also introduces Brave Orders, which are party buffs that don't take up a turn, and are tied to a separate resource. Basically, resource management is a huge part of the battle system in the series, and it does a decent job in adding a certain layer of depth to the battles. The other major feature to the gameplay loop is the quartz system, separated into the quartz and master quartz. This is somewhat comparable to slotting in materia in Final Fantasy games. You can equip your characters with different quartz to obtain skills and passive abilities. The master quartz are similar but can be leveled up through battles, progressively adding more skills and special passive abilities that can significantly change the way that character plays. Some examples of master quartz abilities include one that increases the cast range and effectiveness of healing items, and one that increases your dodge chance and counterattack damage on dodge. There's all sorts of effects and combinations, so you can really mix and match your loadouts to create some truly powerful builds. Something that makes the endgame pretty fun. I had an unstoppable dodge tank with like 90% evasion chance that stacked counterattack gems, and would dodge every hit and retaliate with a one-shot counter. This allows for a lot of flexibility in choosing your team as well, although there are still certain characters that work better with certain builds. Like Elliot, for instance, is mainly going to be a healer or a mage, since his base stats and default quartz slots as well as his S-craft abilities are oriented that way. Still, this really does let you pick and choose your party composition and build up your favorites, or just find the most broken and abusable strats to steamroll the game with. It really is up to you. The specific mechanics of the quartz system vary slightly from game to game as well, but it doesn't really shake up the formula in a profound manner. Battles aside, the general content loop will be something like this. Story segment, then you receive a list of quests, with some optional and some mandatory. Once you complete all the mandatory quests, you can choose to proceed with the next story segment. There's also some other stuff like exploration and bonding events with your teammates sprinkled in between. This gives you a lot of extra content if you're a completionist, or a very clear objective if you only want to rush the story. The last major point I wanted to touch on in regards to the gameplay is a very welcome feature, being the fast forward button. At any point, whether in combat or dialogue, you can toggle on a fast forward to speed the game up. I pretty much had this on for the entire run of the series, except for when I wanted to watch some of the battle animations. But since this is a RPG with pretty much no real-time action mechanics, you don't really miss out on much by utilizing it. This helps immensely with grinding and going through dialogue boxes if you're a fast reader. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the writing and story as a whole. While the overall story and writing is generally pretty well received, there are some criticisms brought up towards Cold Steel, mainly in regards to its liberal use of anime tropes and cliches. As a whole, the Cold Steel arc does feel like it was written to carry a broader appeal, no doubt due in part to it being the series' introduction to 3D and HD home consoles. While the previous Trails arcs aren't exempt from this entirely, many fans do enjoy the more serious tone of the older games. For instance, while the dating sim aspect is relatively downplayed compared to some other JRPGs, it still does exist to an extent, with the player being able to spend time with a waifu of choice to unlock special scenes and dialogue. And this isn't to frame this as a bad thing necessarily. A lot of the scenes are charming and do give some depth to the characters if you're into that kind of thing, even if some of the girls are a little bit too thirsty for the old green bean machine. I guess what I'm getting at is there's definitely a huge emphasis on the whole "my friends are my power" deal, something which I know has turned a lot of people off of certain other games for better or worse. I mean, literally in-universe the characters are equipped with machines that power up based on how strong the bond is between the two users. That doesn't detract from the fantastic world building or political intrigue that Trails has built up in the slightest, but it can make the moment-to-moment scenes a little hard to get through for people with no cringe tolerance to speak of. Another point worth noting is that the series does suffer from some strange pacing issues. Your mileage may vary on your take on this, but the arc does start off pretty slowly. I know I just praised the world building and character development and all, and that does take time, sure, but even so, going through the academy days isn't exactly the most exciting prospect. And strangely enough, despite the arc being 4 full-length RPGs, some parts manage to feel rushed at times, thanks to the time skip between games 2 and 3. Maybe a bit of a nitpick, sure, and each individual title does manage to stand on its own in a satisfying enough fashion for the most part, but it is still something that some people have brought attention to. So in conclusion, it was an ordeal and a half trying to exercise the self-restraint to not talk about more spoily aspects of the games, but that might be something I might save for a later time. Anyways, my big takeaway is that while the nature of the games make it very easy to be critical towards, the overall quality of how the game executes what it's trying to achieve makes it kinda almost not matter in a way. The game is unabashedly riddled with weeby tropes, sure, but it does so in a way that's detached from the greater scope narrative, in a way that doesn't really drag it down with it. Yes, it's not perfect, but it is refreshing how straightforward and earnest the game is in being the best version of itself, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for you. So if you can tolerate that, that's up to the individual, but I definitely think these games are worth giving a shot for anyone who's a fan of RPGs. Even if you start with Cold Steel 1, who knows, it might be the motivation to go back and try Trails in the Sky and the rest of them. Well, thanks for watching my ramblings and thoughts. Hope you enjoyed the video, and let me know if there's another game or series you would like me to cover in detail.